Namaskar.
This is Dr.Raj Persaud and this is Dr.Harish Moorjani.
Hello,
One's in
hello, sir.
London,
Hello, doctor. Hello, doctor.
Good morning.
Nice meeting you. I did some little bit of Google God survey and found out a few things. The big G.
I think since Amish Tripathi is not here, let me extend a warm welcome to the panel and to our viewers and launch into this, if I may.
Thank
You know, the well-being of mind, body, and soul is very crucial at this time, as we have been forced to review our lives, our jobs, our outer world, and our inner landscape, and all because of the pandemic. I've had a very tumultuous lifetime in London, and it's fair to say that we generally take our bodies for granted, and we hate to show any vulnerability or any mental weakness. And it's Edward Munch's famous painting, The Scream, really sums it up for me, because there's a silent scream of fear inside all beings, not only human. But some stress must surely be good for us, because I was thinking about this, and it must have been the rotten climate in Britain and the terrible food that pushed the 16th century Britons to run away and go around gunning down people in far off countries and create the British Empire. Even when I was a student in London, the food was pretty unpalatable. It's not as it is now. But the truth is that we are never satisfied. And we are always looking outwards. We are looking at the Joneses, even though we've got homes and, a surplus of everything. We are chained to mortgages. We are chained to the demands of the purse. And suddenly, we were made to stop, sit, and reflect. Once when Nelson Mandela was asked what he wanted to do, he said, just sit. But sitting out the pandemic has been very hard on all of us. And many have reached the edge, being isolated at home and being imprisoned by our own mind. And now, for our viewers, it's an opportunistic moment to discuss holistic well being. And we have a very distinguished panel to discuss all this and more. So, if I may, I would make a little brief introduction. Sri M needs very little introduction, but I will still say a little bit. He is a modern guru for modern times, and he demonstrates how to live in our crazy world, to do our spiritual practices, to be of service to others, and how to become agents for the change for good. Although he is rooted in ancient Vedantic wisdom, he also assimilated the teachings of different paths, and today he travels all over the globe, teaching people from different cultures and different beliefs. His spiritual journey began at the age of 9, and then later he spent an intense 4 years in Himalayan caves with his own guru. He's an author, social reformer, and activist, has written many books, including his astonishing autobiography. He has received many honors and awards, including the Padma Bhushan from the Indian government. Dr. Harish Moorjani, I'll have to read a bit of this, is a specialist, of course, in infectious diseases and internal medicine in New York. He is clinical assistant professor of medicine at New York Medical College, among other positions, and consultant for the New York State Department of Prisons, including the notorious Sing Sing prison, where he has also run an AIDS program for over 2 decades. As medical director of Westchester Clinic, he re-engineered the care delivery system for the underprivileged, and he also created very successfully the first PCMH, which must be some medical term, level 3 infectious diseases clinic in US, having treated over 5,000 patients in the COVID pandemic. He's very well acquainted with the virus. He's been the recipient of many awards, including the Excellence in Teaching Award by Northwell Healthcare for an unprecedented 2 years in a row, and he is a member of several professional prestigious bodies. Dr. Raj Persaud is a consultant psychiatrist in London. He has worked as honorary senior lecturer at University of London and consultant at NHS hospitals, among other appointments. He holds 8 degrees and diplomas. I don't know how you found the time, including degrees in psychology and statistics. He too has received many awards, including the Maurice Marco Prize of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. He is the author of several books, including textbooks and The Mental Vaccine for COVID-19. He's given many lectures, such as the Florence Nightingale Lecture, frequently appears on TV, and is a member of many prestigious professional bodies too. So I think it may be best to start with the body first. So if I may, I will put a question to Harish Moorjani. Harish, in any conversation today, the pandemic is uppermost in our minds. And you were right there in the front line in New York, which was hit very hard. And bodies were being stored in refrigerated trucks because the graveyards couldn't cope. Many doctors also died. It must have been very traumatic to have so many of your patients dying on your watch. And we sometimes forget that doctors are also human. So, what was that experience like? And can you talk a little bit about the vaccines? There's still a lot of anti vaxxers out there.
Okay, so let me start by saying that I think we are perhaps witnessing the unwinding of the COVID pandemic right now. We may be in the beginning stages of this pandemic coming to somewhat of a close and becoming an endemic where it exists at very low levels. And I think that's important to understand that now that the stress levels for providers like me have come down, we can talk about what happened 2 years ago. In New York 2 years ago, almost everybody will remember it was a nightmare. It was at that time I realized what it took for a soldier to go into war. We were pushed into a situation where this was a new disease, a brand new disease with brand new manifestations, the likes of which we have never seen. It was a different pathogen that arrived on our shores and created a disease presentation which was distinct from all other viral diseases we have seen before. So, what am I trying to say? We had no knowledge. We did not know how to deal with it. We hardly had any tools except for the tools of basic medicine. So, when patients came in critically ill and the spread happened so fast, it was an epidemic and a pandemic in the same system, which was not prepared. We had no personal protective equipment, or very limited amounts. And yet, the healthcare provider community in New York, where the pandemic started in the US, responded with a show of force. People like me were going into the hospitals with hundreds of patients on ventilators on any given day and having to deal with corona bullets flying around. You knew you were going into a war zone. You knew that as providers, you would get exposed to this virus, which was on a killing spree, so to say, at that time. You can imagine the stress that me and people like me and my team went through. So many of us got infected. A few of us actually died. A few doctors, nurses, healthcare providers succumbed to this wretched disease. And in that situation, we made do with limited resources until resources were made available to us several months later. Also, remember, we had no knowledge at that time. People were dying. There was no crematoriums available to keep up with the number of deaths. So there were body bags stored on my exit out of the hospital every day, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, when I was completely exhausted, both mentally and physically. I would walk past these body bags with name tags that I recognized as my own patients. You can imagine the stress that we went through and the stress that we brought back home, along with the knowledge that we may be carrying the virus back home, not only for ourselves, but for our near and dear ones. That kind of trauma, just not only physical trauma, but psychological trauma, resulted in so many of my colleagues still suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. So those were difficult times. And then over the next few months and the last couple of years, a lot of knowledge has emerged, mostly from the United States, some from Europe, and significant amount from countries like India, which has given us the tools to deal with this disease. So much so that today in the United States, in New York, if you give me a patient of COVID, unless there are severe adverse circumstances with comorbidities and the patient is very fragile, most likely the patient will recover and possibly not have the long-term damage. So a lot of my colleagues who suffered, who did not succumb to the disease, but got the infection, have now suffered, are now suffering from long, what we call long COVID. So systems like the heart system, the lung system, brain system, kidney systems are impacted in a long term for a year, year and a half, or even longer. So this virus has created this inflammation in the body, and inflammation is the other term for aging. So, very simply put, this virus speeds up the aging process and causes dysfunctions of body systems that can last for long times. So it's a very unique sort of situation. I'm glad to see that the tools, some of the tools that we have been given by science and scientists and researchers, including vaccines and antivirals and monoclonal antibodies, are allowing us to deal with this pandemic and bring it to a close, at least in the United States and perhaps in the world. So you talked about the vaccines. I think that is one of the highlights of this COVID era. And it highlights the innovation, the science, and how human beings respond, like you mentioned, to a challenge which is unprecedented, which we have never seen, which has caused so much death and destruction, which has caused the entire worldwide system to be re-engineered to continue life in this COVID era. And so these vaccines were developed by brilliant people who not only knew the science behind it, but also were able to bring it to the real world by conducting clinical trials. So I don't understand the anti-vaxxers today. I could have understood their sentiment 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, maybe even a year ago. The science and the technology behind these vaccines that we have created for COVID over the last 2 years has become rock solid. We now have long-term data. We have shown the benefit of these vaccines, which is huge. And we've shown that the risk is minimal up to a point. Now, we don't know what happens beyond the booster shots for vaccinations. I'll give you that. But up to the booster shot, we know that these vaccines are incredibly safe. The vaccines are incredibly effective and can prevent a lot of death and destruction from COVID. Not only do you not get severe disease if you react properly to the full set of vaccines, but you may not get long COVID and you may not compromise your quality and quantity of life. We will only know that 10, 15 years from now as we study these cohorts. So anti-vaxxers, in my mind, from a scientific perspective, have no role in the current pandemic. And then as we continue to evolve in this pandemic, and it will become an endemic that we all are now pretty certain, you're going to continue to see better, safer, easier vaccines that will be more suited for an endemic condition and not a pandemic surge as we saw. The mRNA vaccines and the other adenovirus vector vaccines were perfect for the pandemic surge that we saw. They could be mass produced, they could be mass administered, as India has shown crores of people can be vaccinated in few months period of time. So the anti-vaxxers, I think, have done us a lot of damage by convincing people not to take vaccines, people who believe in these anti-vaxxers. And what we are seeing today in the US, for example, is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, who are not only getting infected and who are not only suffering by either dying, or if they don't die, they have long-term issues and complications and compromising their quality of life, but they're also spreading it to others. So this is currently the pandemic of the unvaccinated in the US. Now, I do also want to talk about the antivirals. So pharmaceutical companies, which we all love to hate, in the in that era of pharmaceutical industry, have given us tools, the antivirals and the monoclonal antibodies, that are allowing us to treat people and cure them. I have personally now treated more than 6 people with the oral antivirals that have been made available to us over the last month and a half in the United States. And I can report that 100% of those people are cured. We have intravenous antivirals that we have been using for the last 1 year in the hospitalized patients with great success. So knowledge has given us tools to take care of our patients so that we have reduced the death rate, the case fatality rate. We have improved survival. And we have brought the transmission of this disease down to really nothing at this current time in the United States. And hopefully we will see this in the rest of the world, including Europe and the third world. So the other thing I'd like to point out is that this pandemic really should be called a syndemic. Why do I say syndemic? Because this is a disease that has highlighted the social disparities in this interconnected global world. So if you don't take care of the third world, if you don't take care of the population in the entire global system, then this virus will continue to find ways to multiply. And that's where resistance will emerge. That's where variants will emerge, mutations will emerge, and the tools that we have, the antivirals, the monoclonal antibodies, and the vaccines that we have may prove to be ineffective. So this pandemic has highlighted that whole issue, that in a global pandemic, in a global interconnected community, we have to take care of the entire world. We have to take care of the social disparities. We have to make sure that the underserved and the disenfranchised get the same preventive care. Otherwise, this virus will continue to multiply and come back to haunt us. So that's one thing. And just to close, I'd like to say that viral diseases will continue to emerge. As humans try to dominate and interfere with the environment, nature fights back with these emergence of these new viral diseases. We are going to continue to see these pandemics, hopefully not as frequently as the influenza disease that we see emerging every year with different influenza viruses, but hopefully much slower. So the last pandemic of the influenza virus occurred in 1918. So this was almost 100 years later. So we hope that the next pandemic won't come sooner than that, or maybe hopefully never. But what is important is that this COVID pandemic has taught us to be better prepared. The innovation that we have seen on a global basis, both in our lifestyle, both in the way we are working, in the way we are conducting ourselves in the world, and the science that has emerged from this COVID pandemic has left us better prepared as a global community. And then the other thing I want to highlight at the end is, at a personal level, this COVID pandemic has brought to light the Ayurvedic principles, which was the traditional observational science of many, many years ago, which has given us many, many tools on a preventive basis, which can alter that interaction between the host, the environment, and the pathogen. So to improve our own immunity by the use of traditional Ayurvedic science, personally and in my sphere of influence, has proven to be extremely effective. Not only that, we must continue to strive to improve our immune system in a holistic way. Using medical science, yes. Using Ayurvedic principles, yes. And lifestyle modification. This pandemic has shown us how that if you are healthy at a personal level, you can better deal with this virus than if you have comorbid conditions. So yes, we've been through 2 years of a lot of stress, Mohini. We have seen a lot of colleagues who have fallen prey to this virus, but we have emerged from it as a stronger medical community and a global basis, better prepared to deal with future emerging pandemics of these viruses.
That's very encouraging to hear. I just want to ask you one thing before moving on. This advance in science, what are the implications of it for other diseases? I mean, if there is new medicine basis available, how does it impact, I don't know, Alzheimer's or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So the medical innovation, for example, I'll highlight with examples. mRNA technology is an innovation that we were working on for 30 years. And we were very successful at it in the oncology era, so cancers. mRNA technology was used to create antibodies against various cancers very successfully. It was used for the first time successfully against a viral disease. So it's a vector that allows us to deliver antigens into the cell that can then create a defense mechanism for the body to fight these emerging viruses. Perhaps we can use it for other infections, such as malaria and tuberculosis and HIV. That remains to be seen, but the mRNA technology is a very exciting technology. The delivery of monoclonal antibodies to fight pathogens has taken on a whole new role as a result of this pandemic. So we have now several antibodies, and we have shown that we can make those at rapid pace. So the response to the pandemic has become much faster. From the tools that we have from science that has generated these tools can now be developed much faster than ever before. So instead of taking 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to bring a monoclonal antibody to the market that can be effective against these emerging pandemics and pathogens, it now happens in months. And I think that's very encouraging. The use of antivirals, developing antivirals in 6 months, oral antivirals, so that helps us deal with these infections, has been another encouraging development. So several of this, we have re-engineered the way we work. The use of masks and personal protective devices, in which we call COVID appropriate behavior, will allow us to deal with the spread of other viral diseases, not just COVID-19. For example, influenza, parainfluenza, and other respiratory diseases, other GI diseases. So transmission of these other diseases will also come down because of the nature of our behavior in the COVID era. So lots and lots of positives. So that's the medical side of it, the business side of it, the innovations that have occurred there. I will not talk about. I'm not an expert, but it's
I think no, that's very encouraging. And moving forward, we can take hope from that.
Yeah.
So moving to the next piece of the jigsaw, Raj, I'm intrigued by your book, Mind, a User's Guide. And what's more, you have written a chapter titled A User's Guide to the Female Mind. My word, you are brave. The Women's Project for Equality is only about 60 years old, and while it's been a man's world for thousands of years, but we'll have to discuss that another time. What I want to ask you today is how difficult has it been in the pandemic to help people with fear, depression, suicidal thoughts? Because even before this, some minds were trapped in, past regrets, future anxieties. And can the mind heal the body?
Well, these are all excellent questions. So I work as a consultant psychiatrist. So that means that I'm trained in the tradition of Western medicine, and I work in central London. And you're asking an excellent question. We just heard from a very distinguished doctor talking in a very important and real way about the physical impact of the pandemic in terms of death rates. And these are very, very serious things. But in the long run, I strongly suspect we will look back in 20 or 30 years' time and realize that the real impact of the pandemic is in our mental health and our emotional health. And that is a vast untapped iceberg, because one of the key problems with mental health is it's essentially private. If you're physically very ill, it's usually a publicly verifiable or publicly observable event. And one of the problems with mental health, it's private, it's on the inside, and our ability to think about our mental health and not get confused by terms like just because you are experiencing emotional distress doesn't actually mean you have a formal mental health problem. And I've written a book called The Mental Vaccine for COVID-19, which explores all the emotional and mental health implications. And just to quote one piece of research, obviously the Spanish flu pandemic back in 1918, which we've just referred to, led to death rates involving millions and millions of people. But the research on the emotional and mental health impact is very interesting. It suggests that if you think about the fact there was probably an emotional and mental health impact on the strain in terms of the people surviving it, that was pretty important and massive. But then their children, the research now suggests, were affected, and their children's children were affected. In terms of you can actually have a measurable impact on people's personality and mental health and emotional lives 3 generations after a worldwide pandemic, which is really quite startling. So there's not just an immediate effect in terms of high rates of anxiety and depression and high rates in terms of suicide, but this is an impact that will last many years after this very important technology has solved the practical problems of saving people's lives, which is obviously also very important. Now, Albert Camus, a famous French author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, wrote a book called The Plague, where he explored in a very prophetic sense, because the book was published in the late 1940s, the emotional impact of the plague. So I'm going to say something very provocative and challenging and perhaps slightly startling, which is Camus' argument is that we are missing what the real plague is. We get distracted, and in the book it's about a North African town that's affected by a mysterious plague that comes from rats and a bacterium from the rats. But the reason why the book is called The Plague is Camus is arguing there's actually a deeper underlying plague that we suffer from in terms of our problems of existence, which the plague that arrives via the virus or the bacterium merely exposes an underlying plague. And we've just heard the distinguished doctor talk about the fact that widespread inequality across the world will lead to a re-emergence of these plagues. So Camus' very prophetic argument will be, for example, that what the plague has exposed is deeper underlying problems with our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with each other. The deeper underlying plague, for example, is the notion that worldwide inequality is going to cause us deep trouble. And the plague that's arrived recently should focus our attention on that. There's a sense in which the plague that's arrived recently has held up a mirror to ourselves, because the plague took away a lot of things that we depended on. There were lockdowns. It meant we couldn't go and play tennis. We couldn't hang out with our friends. So it held up a mirror because we were forced to examine ourselves in a way that we have never been forced to before, because we could pursue all the distractions that helped us divert our attention away from truly contemplating what it is to be ourselves and the central questions of what it is to lead a life, what it is to be resilient in the face of disaster and cataclysm. And one of the things the pandemic did was it removed all of the things, because it's a once-in-a-century event, that we normally relied on. So we had to fall back on ourselves. And what was exposed was an underlying plague in terms of our relationship with ourselves. We couldn't sit in a room by ourselves without the distractions of the technology. And it was very interesting how the Western world turned to technology as the answer over and over again to problems. So I think that although the physical side has been disastrous, and Western medicine, Western scientific-based medicine, has produced very, very important solutions to some of these problems, there are some problems that are beyond Western technology. And I think that the Eastern view, the Eastern philosophical view, which tends to be a bit more inwardly directed and a bit more accepting of the fact that life actually at its core presents many problems that are not solvable in the Western sense that you just throw technology at the problem and you'll solve it. So I think that as we come out of this worldwide pandemic, we will move away from Western-focused solutions, I know I'm saying something slightly provocative here, and more Eastern-style solutions, which is to more be thinking about ourselves, our inner lives. And I think Eastern philosophy has often been a bit stronger on that front than the Western outlook on life. So I hope I've addressed some of the points that you've made.
Brilliantly. And I'm utterly convinced I need to book myself a session with you when I'm back in London.
Thank you.
So, Shri M, you, of course, deal with all three. You address body, mind, and soul all the time, but the human capsule is a mystery to most. The body is tangible, but the mind and soul are elusive. But even Einstein asked, have you crafted a beautiful soul? Now, in the pandemic, you have had to deal more urgently with the distress of your followers. And what is the interplay between mind, body, and soul? And is it even possible to find a balance between the three? And if so, what is the method to unite our physical, mental, and spiritual selves?
Thank you, Mohini ji. Actually, after the wonderful two talks given by Dr. Harish Moorjani and Dr. Raj Persaud, I must say that they have in their own way covered much of the topics which I would like to discuss in a different way. One in a medical way and the other in a psychological way. So only the soul is left to me now. So, but they are all they are all interlinked. You're right. This pandemic, I'm not specifically using the names, but I'm quoting both the doctors who are experts in their field. It's 100% I agree that this was a pandemic which was unexpected. This was something we had to deal with when it came. And the medical profession has done a good job. However, I think I agree with Dr. Raj Persaud that we should now also give more importance to the Eastern way of thought. Why? Because you said your followers must have suffered. Not only my followers, there were so many people suffering. When it comes to suffering, you don't look at a follower, non-follower, I mean, everybody is suffering. So, and also, you know, Mohini ji, I don't like that word follower. It sounds very funny. It's like
I apologize.
you're in front and somebody is following you like sheep. No. So you know how I work. So what I'm trying to say that I saw this in my immediate neighborhood and also in faraway places. People were in a state of panic, actually. Well, medical science was still tackling the problem. I am a person who totally believes that vaccinations are important. We'll come to the mind vaccine later, but even physical vaccinations are very, very important. And I think if India is, I don't know if we were still classified as a third world, but we did a wonderful job with the vaccinations. People were ready to follow the instructions of the government that everybody has to get vaccinated. I don't think hardly anybody is left who has not had a vaccination. Now this is what I'm trying to say, that just because we are grounded in the spiritual world and the soul and so on. Why? Because for 1,000 years when the Western world was involved in scientific research of the material world, the scientists in this country were involved in research on the inner. So we have gathered a lot of information. And I think we have that technology with us, which unfortunately people don't resort to. And here I must add that, like Dr. Harish said, Dr. Harish Moorjani said, Ayurveda has to be taken into account. We have to have an integrated system of medicine. Ayush is very much into this in India. We need to have an integrated medical system. There are many Ayurvedic medicines, and if you research, we might find many more things in this Ayurveda. Having said that, I fully believe that scientific technology, as far as vaccination and so on goes, is very, very important. To be spiritual is not to be superstitious. These are two things. To be spiritual is to be very scientific. However, having said that, now I must come to Dr. Raj Persaud. He said there is an underlying plague. He was, of course, trying to look at Camus and his novel, but this underlying plague is the fear that we have. Every one of us has this fear of death, of course, because it is evident. It's in front of us. People are dying. I live in a small, remote little town called Madanapalli, which is in Andhra Pradesh. I'm sitting there right now. I have got myself a recording studio because of the pandemic. Because I couldn't go out, we couldn't travel, so I was using this throughout the pandemic. I think I must have talked more than I did before the pandemic. Because people wanted to know what's going on, how to handle this. Although they know I'm not a medical professional, but somehow people tend to think I'm a mind doctor. Not as a psychiatrist, of course, but a mind doctor in my spiritual way. So what I found was this thing called lockdowns, which came in, which the government announced, which was good, made people think that they were in complete isolation. Now, isolation has two problems. One is living alone. We don't live alone. Second, to live alone with family members with whom we have never lived for such long periods of time inside the house. You go off to work in the morning, you don't come back, so there is not much to fight or quarrel about. But you stay throughout. What happens? Two aspects to this. I been saying this for the last 2 years. Please change that word isolation into solitude. Don't use the word isolation. Call it solitude, because in India especially, also in other countries, the monks, the spiritual people have deliberately welcomed solitude and have gone into solitude for periods of time. And some of them came out with brilliant textbooks they wrote while they were in solitude. Because solitude, this is from the mind's point of view. I know this pandemic, as Dr. Harish said, in Hindi we say muh mein shakkar daliye, which means put sugar into your mouth, which is a wonderful thing that you said. I think this pandemic has now become endemic. We see that everywhere. It's coming down, but that doesn't mean that another thing should not come up. It could at any point, and I also agree that it's man's interference with nature. All this climate change and various exploitation by human beings that could trigger up another thing is possible. I hope not. Let's hope not. Why? Change our lifestyles, make things better so that when it comes, we are ready to handle it. And therefore, I think in this period of solitude, this I have been saying throughout, use this time to study, time which you could not. Of course, busy doctors have to be in the hospitals. That's a different matter. I'm saying others. What about others? Use it to improve your mind. And mind matters. This is what I agree with you, Dr. Raj. Mind matters. Mind is a very important thing. I tell you that I have seen many people who go into the hospital with, what are those things? I don't know. Oxygen masks and so on put on them. And I looked at this, I was making a survey myself, that many people who survived were those whose minds were calm and quiet. Those who panicked had very slim chance of coming out, even though the same medicines and the same treatment was given to them. Now, from our point of view, a calm mind, from my point of view, is a very essential thing for a human being. And this is something which can be actually developed and practiced in solitude. So even though now the pandemic has become endemic and it's gone, I would still ask people or request people to spend some time in solitude. Let's not wait for the pandemic. Spend some time in solitude where you look at yourself, going in, looking at oneself. This is the difference generally between the West and the East. That the East talks about the Nivritti Marga, which means turning within. And the West usually talks about the Pravritti Marga, which is going out. But in such conditions, we require both. We cannot survive with just one. However, don't consider the going in as less important than the going out. So, for me, the ancient science of yoga and Vedanta have helped a great deal to handle the situation. I also got vaccinated. If I did not get vaccinated, as Mohini ji said, my followers, in brackets, would not have got vaccinated. I got vaccinated. I was not afraid that I might get COVID. No, I thought maybe it will come, maybe it will not, but get your vaccination done. So I got it done. It's to set an example. However, the most important thing was I kept in touch with every one of them on internet, talking to them about the mind, about the soul, how to go within and enjoy this solitude and not consider it to be isolation. And to be spiritual, which means to offer whatever you can, however little, to your neighbors who are in the suffering mode. If these things can be brought together, I think it will be a wonderful way, not only now, but also in future, when we see another pandemic or whatever comes out, some virus. Who knows where these viruses are? Doctors say they lie hidden everywhere. They're only waiting for a chance. So don't provide a chance. Well, when it comes, there are ways of handling it. Now it's been proved. But in the first place, avoid. And Ayurveda is one thing which is Basically, if you follow what is called dinachara, way of life, and also the medicines, it can't be just the medicines. Unfortunately, Ayurveda, though it has become popular these days, is not something you buy across the drugstore and eat the tablets. No, you have to follow certain rules and regulations in life for optimum effectiveness. This is very important. So, I want to stop now after having said this, because we may get into a discussion. The whole world is an important thing to keep in mind. Not east or west or you or me, but the whole world. And the ancient Vedic sloka, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha, becomes very important, which simply means may the whole world be happy. Not only me in my house. And utilize the time available to us to grow mentally strong, to grow soulfully. I'm using this word, I don't know if it's the right expression, soulfully behave towards others. Everybody, according to me, everybody has a divine spark in them. To serve humanity is to serve God. It is better than going to a temple and doing some kind of a worship or a church. When you serve humanity, you are serving a temple that is moving, while that temple is stuck there in one place. And in this temple, in the core of consciousness, is a spark of the divine. This is my experience and understanding. So, I have only to say that it was a very enlightening coming together of minds. I'm not putting myself into this bracket, but the doctors, both of them, I wouldn't say I was surprised, because I read some of your biography, but I think we should listen carefully to what both of them said. And when you sometimes sit quietly and reflect, also think of what M said. Maybe putting all these things together, we have a brighter future coming. And really, it's heartening to hear the expression that the pandemic has now become an endemic. I hope this endemic also ends and we look forward to a bright future. Thank you, doctors, and thank you, Mohini ji. So we could have a discussion on any of these topics
Yes.
now.
Made a very important point about the world being interdependent and, to be of service to others. But I will leave it to Raj and Harish in case you want to say something or ask
Yes, I wanted to
something.
pick up on the point about the interconnectedness of the world, which has been highlighted more starkly by the virus than ever before. Obviously, we understood because travel restrictions meant that we were interconnected with the world, and that's one of the ways the virus spread, right? But the interconnectedness, going back to the underlying plague argument of Albert Camus, that we neglect this sense of interconnectedness, and we have to be thinking not just about ourselves, but the whole world. Otherwise, we're going to end up in trouble again. And I want to pick up on the anti-vaccine point that has been made earlier. What's very interesting about the research about which parts of America are often the least vaccinated or have the highest anti-vax sentiment, they're often, oddly enough, very wealthy areas. And in wealthy societies where, generally speaking, people are going to be healthy because they live in a first world type conditions, it's easy to be anti-vaccine because you're not staring death and disaster and disease in the face on a daily basis. In poor countries where death and disease is around every corner, you'd get very little anti-vaccination sentiment. Everyone wants the vaccine. It's very cheap, very powerful, effective way of dealing with disease. And one of the problems is these wealthy people in America who are anti-vax don't realize something, which is that anti-vax sentiment makes it more difficult for companies, pharmaceutical companies, to innovate and devote resources to vaccinations. And it has implications for the third and fourth world, who need the vaccines more than anyone else. So one of the things that's happening, in my view, with the anti-vax sentiment is they're thinking very selfishly or personally. They're not thinking about the widespread implications. And one practical example is there was a rotavirus vaccine that was withdrawn recently. When it turns out, when you inspect the data, the FDA and the authorities in America are a bit trigger happy about withdrawing because they were too nervous about the anti-vax sentiment. And that had direct implications because rotavirus as a disease kills many more people in poor countries than it does in the West. So there is a widespread global implication for anti-vaccine sentiment in terms of depriving poor people from vaccines when they need the vaccines more, and they want the vaccines. So there's something about the interconnectedness of the world that I think is quite important in that area.
Harish, do you have an observation or a question?
Yeah, so for me, COVID has taught us that the happy sangam of medical science and spirituality is how you best deal with this COVID pandemic, which is, I think, is starting to unwind. So, Sriyam, I don't think we are at the endemic stage yet, but I think this is the beginning of an era where we are going to see the unwinding of the pandemic, and it's going to become endemic in the near future, I hope. I think
Sorry, I got it.
all there, but it's not yet over, but hopefully soon. At least in the areas where we have antivirals, it should be very soon.
I think so too, doctor.
Okay.
I think it's in the process.
Yes, I agree. So more importantly, I think on the anti-vaxxer sentiment, I'm not sure it's the wealthy. I think we have seen areas like Mississippi and others where people and Texas where people were not that wealthy, New Orleans, for example. So it doesn't matter whether you're wealthy or not wealthy. This virus has shown us that if you don't believe in medical science, robust medical science, this virus will hold you accountable for your choices. So a lot of the people who were unvaccinated have suffered, not only death, but a lot of destruction on their own body systems. And I think that will be a lesson to be learned for the anti-vaxxer sentiment. I have no problem with people at a personal level making choices about medical decisions. I'm perfectly for that. I'm totally pro-choice. Or however, if you choose to not get vaccinated and the virus holds you accountable, don't expect the society to then bear the brunt and the cost of taking care of you. We've seen that sentiment emerge in Singapore. So I think not only should the virus hold people accountable for their medical choices, but the society itself must design systems where the individual is held accountable for their choices of whether to take the vaccine or not to take the vaccine. I think that's the way it should go. It should not be mandates. It should be positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and allow people to make their choices, because that's how the society as a global world will progress and learn to believe in medical science. So today we have medical science that's absolutely phenomenal, but that medical science, as 3M pointed out, must coexist with spirituality. So it makes us better prepared. Our lifestyle choices must be done in a holistic way, not just in allopathic medicine, but as this pandemic has taught us, with Ayurvedic principles, with lifestyle change, with preventive medicine. So that's been brought into focus. I do have a question for you, Raj. What happened? So in this world where a lot of us suffered from psychological and psychiatric trauma, forget about the physical part of it. We were completely exhausted, but some of us survived. But a lot of my colleagues still have post-traumatic stress disorder.
I was going to ask the same.
Their family members are suffering from psychological stress.
Can I interrupt for a minute to say, can we keep it brief? There are a few questions for Shriyam from the UK Satsang group, and we've only got 10-15 minutes left. So Raj, I'll let you respond to that.
1 second. Mohini ji, I was going to ask the same question which Dr. Harish ji asked to Dr. Raj. The future implications of how to handle this, how the mind. Anyway,
well, it's an excellent question, and it loops back into the Eastern approach to life. So there's two main coping skills in life, right? No matter what disaster you face. And me just simply saying that statement, which is provocative and challenging, is a big step forward in terms of coping, because it stops people wasting their time looking for the wrong coping response. And the key thing is to focus on coping, whereas people often focus on the problem and complain about the problem. And the coping response is the key mediating variable. There's the problem, the virus or the stress or the car crash you've just been in. Then there's the reaction you mount. Just like our immune system mounts a reaction, our psychological system mounts a reaction. And that's the key territory, right? What's the best reaction to mount? And we have control over that reaction, which is something Eastern philosophy is very interested in. The notion of control of ourselves, which the West to some extent has abandon. And it's quite interesting. My Western patients are often quite emotional. And I like to say they worship at the altar of emotion, because Hollywood and the arts kind of emphasize emotional experiences as being what the most important thing life is about. Whereas controlling your inner space and inner self, which is what Eastern philosophy to some extent is about, gaining dominion over that, is something that the West has neglected. So there's problem solving, coping skill number one, and doctors are natural problem solvers. They want to solve problems, and you want a doctor who is a problem solver. Problem solving is act on the world, change it, make it a less stressful place. And you are obviously an excellent problem solver. What is the one time problem solvers run into trouble and they can't cope? When they have a problem that is either not immediately solvable or may not be solvable at all. And now you've got to move into the second coping skill, where Eastern philosophy is much stronger on than Western philosophy. Western philosophy is, we've got to problem solve everything. Eastern philosophy says, there's some things that just aren't solvable, and we need to come to terms with that. There are a lot of things that aren't solvable. Death is not a solvable problem. It's coming our way, and we have to come to terms with it. And that's called, there's a Western term for it. Eastern philosophy will have a different view. It's called emotionally focused coping. What does that mean? Stop trying to act on the world, act on yourself, alter yourself, adjust yourself so that you can cope better with the difficult circumstances you find yourselves in. Doctors in particular, you mentioned your colleagues, have trouble with that because they're always in problem-solving mode. And at the heart of great coping is the ability to change mode depending on what circumstance you find yourself in. And there are only two main modes: problem-solving, emotionally focused coping. Now, when you go to a doctor, you don't want them to be in emotionally focused coping mode going, listen, we're going to have to learn to come to terms with it. You want them to run tests. You want them to prescribe drugs. You want them to go down the problem-solving route. But we all have to realize when we need to switch from problem-solving or away from it to the other main strategy, which is emotionally focused coping. And most people with PTSD are having trouble with that switch, in my opinion. That's a very brief summary in the short time we have of a massive area, but I hope that makes sense to some extent what I'm trying, what I hope. The key point I want to make is there are solutions. There are solutions to the questions you are raising. And unfortunately, they're not being disseminated enough because the focus is too much on the idea that technology is always the answer.
Shriyam, would you like to add anything to that, or we've got only a few minutes left, or should I
I'm
read
okay
out
with
the questions? Okay,
I'm
because
okay with
Jayakumar and Gantavya and all have got together and sent a list of questions.
Oh my God, we have only 10 minutes, Lady Mohini.
I don't think we have even 10 minutes. We've got about 5 minutes. So anyway, one is that what is love? How do we maintain its pureness without getting attached?
This is not a question which we can cover in 5 minutes, first of all.
5 seconds.
Yeah, 5 seconds. Because the word love is so much bandied about. And it is associated generally with emotional attachments. And I fell in love. All that happened. But I think if they ask, the question is asked to me. So my answer is, if you can have affection to somebody, expecting nothing at all in return, absolutely nothing in return, then you can call it love. But generally it is not so. I keep 3 times I say I love you, and the other person has to respond at least once, otherwise I feel depressed. No, that cannot be love. Love is, as Jesus Christ said in the gospel, it's like, let not the left hand know what the right hand giveth. That is love. It's rare, of course, it's not so easy. I have seen only one person like that, my own spiritual master. He gained nothing by giving me all that he gave, nothing. And yet he didn't ask anything in return. His satisfaction was that I got it, that's it. Now, that is love, and it has actually, it translates itself into action, but deep down, you cannot define it. It's difficult. The moment I define it, then it's done. I know this sounds abstract, but the popular saying, people say love is blind, right? So, and then the other hand, they say God is love. So are we saying that God is blind? I mean, logic in ancient Tarka Shastra in India, Nyaya, if this is true and that is true and both are true, then this thing must be true. So it's not that. If somebody said love is blind, it simply means like justice. You know, the justice ties a cloth around her head and holds the balance in the hand. This is what is meant by it, which means give with expecting nothing in return. This is the expression of love, from my understanding. Sorry.
One more question, then we'll wind up, which is that if Devika Nargarkar says, if both are good and bad actions produce an effect of karmic reactions, then how do we get out of this vicious cycle?
I don't think this is a question that should be discussed in this particular context about karma and so on and so forth. But since she has asked this question, what they're trying to say, if you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he has given 5 distractions of the mind, of which one is good action and the other is harmful action. Both are distractions of the mind. So therefore, from the point of view of reaching a higher level of consciousness, one should free oneself from both good and bad. Now, how can one do that? In this world, while we live, we have to choose between the good and the bad. We can't say both are okay. What they're trying to say is this world by its very nature has both light and darkness. I mean, black and white and so on. Goodness and we can say evil, both are there in this world. So it's for us to choose what is best for us and keeping in mind the rest of the world. Freedom should also have responsibility. I'm free to choose this because it gives me satisfaction, but what about my responsibility to the others, to the neighbors, to the world? So when that judgment comes in, then I know how to handle this. About karmas, about past birth, this is not the venue to go into this and discuss. Although I fully believe in past birth, and you know that I have written this book, The Journey Continues, which is, the other day a young person brought this book for signing. I said, you're going to read a crazy book because it's, it's talking about past lives, which is difficult to understand, difficult to digest, because we think only about this life.
Right. Well, I think time is almost up. I think our viewers would have got greater clarity about their physical, mental, and soul selves and how to unite these warring selves within this one entity. And I thank you very sincerely, Shri M, Raj, Harish, for joining us and doing this. And I thank the Nehru Center and the director, Amish Tripathi, and the entire team and the technical team for hosting us. And it's been a marvelous session. So I can't even say safe journey home. We are all at home anyway.
Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.